Austin-based game studio Certain Affinity has announced plans to open a second development center in Toronto. The company is best known for its work as a co-developer on the Halo, Call of Duty, and Doom franchises, but is now looking to create its own original titles from scratch. As reported by the Austin Statesman, the move is being financed with an $18 million development loan from Chinese company Leyou Technologies, which acquired a 20% stake in Certain Affinity back in 2017. The news follows the recent expansion of Certain Affinity's studio in Austin, which was boosted with the addition of an event space and around 55 fresh hires. Company president and founder Max Hoberman said the new Toronto studio will initially house around 16 staffers, and will allow it to tap into the city's various universities and game development programs while laying down international roots. He also believes the expansion is essential if the studio wants to successfully transition to the games as a service model, as they will need more firepower to continue supporting titles post-launch. In the past, we primarily partnered with other developers as an extension of their internal teams, working on a specific subset of a game. Now, we are taking on all the functions of a game in its entirety, from concept to completion, explained Hoberman. We are also transitioning to develop games as a service. So after we ship a game, we will continue to develop new content and features for that game into the foreseeable future. Procedural and random generation are the cornerstones of roguelike design, and we have seen many games push these elements further than they have ever been. This past year with Dead Cells, and games like The Binding of Isaac, Spelunky, and of course, Dwarf Fortress, all provide replayability thanks to those elements. One game design trap I see is developers trying to build a Zelda Rogue-Like experience, and while this may sound like the next evolution of procedural design, it just does not work from a game design perspective. As always, let's quickly define the difference between procedural and randomly generated content. Randomized content refers to set elements that are shuffled around in a level. Enemy positions in Dead Cells are what treasures appear in The Binding of Isaac are examples of this. Procedural design is when the game creates something from scratch, either before or during the running of the game. Loot generation in an or found level design in Spelunky are examples of this. Roguelikes typically feature both kinds of generation to define the experience, and it's important to understand how much they impact the gameplay. Not all random or procedurally generated elements are equal in the eyes of the player and their impact on the game space. We have spoken about how just because your game has random, or even procedural, elements in it, does not make it replayable. Many titles that make use of either form will still adhere to a specific progression curve. Survival games are a huge example of this. No matter how much the environment is generated, the player still has to gather resources in a specific order. See Minecraft as an example. Without having a better term to use, we can say that there are hard and soft elements that can be randomized, are procedurally created in a game. A soft element is something that does not impact the gameplay or progression loop of a title, where enemies spawn, basic environments, biome positions. A hard element does impact the player's ability to play the game, and change what they can and cannot do at one time. What upgrades spawn, new items, biome types, enemy types, new resources, etc. The important factor is that what the player is doing in the game must be effected in order for playthroughs to feel different to them. This is why loot in ARPG design works so well, as adding a piece of gear changes the player's build. Normally, just changing the map around does not lead to different experiences, as the player is still doing the same thing. The reason why Spelunky holds up so well is that even though the core gameplay does not change, by giving the player more levels to go through, it keeps creating different tests of the player's ability. And that takes me to this idea of a Zelda Rogue-Like and the inherent problems with it. The Legend of Zelda franchise is considered to be one of the best action-adventure series in the industry. Similar to the Souls franchise, every aspect of Zelda is hard-coded to push and guide the player through to the very end. Even Breath of the Wild being the most open-ended take on Zelda still introduced progression points in the form of the Guardians, the Master Sword, etc. Being able to take that handcrafted design and progression and put it in a procedurally designed world sounds like a holy grail form of gameplay. Unfortunately, there are several design flaws with this concept. When we look at the Zelda gameplay loop, the player is essentially doing two things: exploring to find points of interest, engines, items, etc., and performing the task of said point of interest. The latter is more interesting and more important compared to the former. The world of a Zelda game is always inherently designed to force progression. This simply means that the environmental design will guide the player to what they need to do. It's the same concept as what we'll see in Soulsborne titles, and how placing harder enemies in an area creates some metaphorical roadblock to tell the player to come back later. By trying to randomize, the world ends up making things less interesting and more frustrating. Because the world is always going to be different, it means that from a design standpoint, you have to make the environmental design less complicated in order to accommodate the shuffled nature. Outside of the points of interest, the world itself will always be less interesting to go through compared to a hard-coded game. Not only that, but it creates a situation where the player could find points of interest and have no idea if they are supposed to be there or not. The beauty of Zelda's formula was that the dungeons and points of interest always build on top of the previous. This makes the progression curve more interesting and allows the designers to keep raising the stakes with each new dungeon. Breath of the Wild went in a different direction by making every dungeon beatable with your basic loadout and balancing the areas based on how easy or hard it was to reach them. Another problem is that because the upgrades are the only elements that change the game experience, simply shuffling or procedurally generating the environment is not changing how someone plays the game. A popular design that developers use is generating the overworld map, while still making the points of interest hard-coded. See the game Darkwood as an example. The issue is that once again, changing the environment around is not impacting how someone plays the game. If the player always needs item X,
Y,
and Z in order to win, then all you are doing by shuffling the environment is changing the amount of time needed to get those items. As we already mentioned, you cannot develop unique or different challenges in the overworld, as you are unable to know what order the player is getting their upgrades. What's worse is if the points of interest are set up to use items from the other ones, but the player has no idea of knowing that when they first arrive. This is why the better roguelikes focus on a core gameplay loop that then grows out and changes based on what is given to the player. Both the Binding of Isaac and Dead Cells have their ranks changed dramatically based on what items show up, not what environments they go through, while Spelunky sticks with a basic gameplay loop, but mixes up what the player is doing via the level generation. The key element of any successful rogue-like is how many ways you can provide the player with a different experience. When it comes to Zelda-rogues, every one that I have played makes me wish that the environment was fixed and the points of interest were, well, more interesting.